Okay, so welcome to this ACUR ANU student presentation session. We acknowledge and respect the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respects to the elders past and present. Today I'm on Dharawal Nation land, so I encourage everyone to think about the land that they are on. My name is Molly Turnbull and I'll be chairing today's session, and our first presenter for today is Michael, so when you're ready.
Thanks, Molly. Okay. Can everyone see this?
Yeah, it looks good. Take it away.
All right, thank you so much. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael G, and I am a civil and environmental engineering major undergraduate at UC Berkeley. And today I'll be talking about my research that I conducted over the summer at University of Louisiana Lafayette. And my research is on enhanced absorption of fluorooctanoic acid, or also known as PFOA, from aqueous solution by oak sawdust-derived activated carbon. So in the 1940s, there was this chemical that was discovered in a lab called PFOA, and it had these like magical properties, and people named it the modern miracle day of chemistry because it was able to repel both oil and water, and these gave it many, many vast applications in industry for manufacturing different kinds of products. And many of these products we see in our everyday life. And so this can include things like waterproof jackets, fast food wrappers, firefighting foams, and the non-stick cooking appliances like the Teflon pans that we cook with. However, after we use these products, they started leaching and ending up into the lakes and streams. And this is where we get our water from. And they even detected PFOA to be in the mountains of the Himalayas, which is the most remote location on Earth. And so since we get a drinking water that has PFOA inside it, it has ended up in our bloodstreams, and it's estimated to be in the bloodstreams of nearly all of humankind. And this is really, really scary because many researchers have found links between PFOA exposure and cancer. So the PFOA that's inside our bloodstreams is carcinogenic, which is very scary, and can also cause many other serious health and human health problems. So the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States classified this chemical as a carcinogen, and they set a health advisory recommendation to limit the PFOA exposure in water to 700 parts per trillion, which is very, very sensitive. So our lab, we tried to, our goal was to remove this chemical PFOA from the water. And traditionally, this chemical, the way that they try to remove this chemical is through a process called absorption. And they found that this absorption process works best for removal of PFOA. However, most of the conventional ways of absorption is through coal, which is a type of fossil fuel. So our lab tried to use a more sustainable process through using a waste product of the oak industry. So whenever they make these cuts into the oak for like, I guess, structures and stuff like that, there's a whole bunch of sawdust being generated. In fact, for every 1,000 cubic feet of, sorry, this is American units, cubic feet of sawdust being cut, 20 cubic feet of sawdust is generated, which is enormous. And so we wanted to use this waste product for good use. And so we start off with our waste product, which is the oak sawdust. We add some eco-friendly compounds to that. And then we do some carbonization, which basically is a fancy word for putting it in a really, really hot oven. And we found that 900 degrees Celsius is the optimum temperature to get the best results for the absorbent capacity, which is basically how much PFOA can stick to the surface of the compound of the adsorbent. And additionally, this is kind of like the results that we got compared to the conventional activated carbon. So on the left, this axis here is the absorbent capacity, how much PFOA can stick to the surface of the material per amount of mass. And then this is our activated carbon here that we've developed in our lab. And these are like the two most common commercial ones, so granular activated carbon and the powdered activated carbon. And as you can see, our activated carbon in terms of absorbent capacity is twice as is absorbent per unit mass, which is really cool. Additionally, in terms of the raw cost of the activated carbon, ours is twice as cheap as the next cheapest, most commonly commercial ones on the market, which is also really cool. So as I mentioned before, our activated carbon is a renewable. It comes from oak sawdust and is a waste product. And additionally, it can overcome electrostatic force. And so what this means is that in very basic pHs, the absorbent capacity goes down a lot. And in the commercial ones, they are unable to really absorb any PFOA at those really basic conditions. However, our activated carbon still works to some extent, like pretty well actually, in terms of the absorbent capacity in basic soils. So our effectiveness, abundance, the abundance meaning like the oak sawdust is very, very common around the world because a lot of places have oak grown, and then the low cost of this material. We believe this could provide a very sustainable, a widespread solution to address PFOA contamination. And we hope that this low cost will allow all types of communities, regardless of their, the amount of money that they have, to access this activated carbon technology. And we hope that this will eliminate the human and ecological exposure to the carcinogenic PFOA. Thank you.
Fantastic work. So if people have any questions from the attendees, please put them in the chat. That'd be really good. I can also check the Q&A box, but chat's preferred. But we'll go to the judges to start with if they have any questions.
Yep. Can I go first? Very nice talk, Michael. And you presented the case very well. I just have a question that when you mentioned that absorption process works very well to remove PFOA, did you consider any other processes or is it the only one known?
In terms of like removing PFOA, like the other mechanisms?
No, PFOA.
Oh, like other types of like PFASs or like other types of processes to remove PFOA?
Other processes. So any other processes?
Yeah, so there's reverse osmosis, which is what they use for desalination, which basically is when they run PFOA through a membrane, right? Mm-hmm. But we found this through this review, we found that this technology is very impractical for the purposes of removing PFOA because you need a lot of pressure and like a lot of energy to really push it through the membrane, and it also breaks and clogs the membrane a lot. And so in terms of like the cost to remove the PFOA, it's not as good effectively. Okay. And then there's another one, which is degradation, which basically is like breaking apart the molecule so that it won't be in the same form as before, just like, I guess, elements floating around as ions. And this process required a lot of harsh chemicals to be used. And if there's a lot of like a Superfund site, like something like that, or something like that, you don't really want to introduce a lot of these like really corrosive chemicals into the environment, because that will also lead to other things that we don't want to happen into the environment. And additionally, the chemicals can be really expensive, and then sometimes the temperature to break down these chemicals can be quite high. So it can be expensive, high, and it could be also quite dangerous as well. So we found that absorption would be the best process to remove PFOA. Okay.
So in summary, you conclude that environmentally and cost effectively, and in terms of also performance, this is the best one. I have another question, which is that you will keep talking about cost, and you have also that comparison. So what these cost numbers are, like we can see that of course the cost is low, but how, what are the cost figures, for example, commercially, if there is any rough idea?
So we actually haven't measured like the amount of energy it takes to manufacture it. We did find that 900 degrees Celsius is the optimum temperature for the carbonization process, which is quite high in terms of energy usage. So maybe if there's an alternative way of heating it up through a solar powered heater or something like that, that would be a great idea. But you're right, in terms of the cost, we don't really know, but it could probably be higher than the granular activated carbon. But I think there's a trade-off because in terms of its performance in basic conditions, it would be very impractical to change the pH of the water to make it more acidic for the commercial ones right now to work when you could do it without changing it without activated carbon.
Okay, thank you. That's from me.
Thanks for the question.
I have a questions. So,
Yeah.
question number one. So where did your research motivation come from? So, how did you get involved in this research?
Well, I've always wanted to work in something environmental justice related, something where different communities that didn't, I guess, necessarily have the funds to do things could still protect the environment around them and the community. And so when I was looking for projects to do this summer, this one really stood out because PFOA is something that causes like a public health concern because it's carcinogenic, and cancers are like a very devastating thing for like not just the families but for the communities around them and their friends and stuff. So I really want to do something that could be impactful to really prevent things like cancer and stuff to happen. And I really fell in love with this project because of the cost, where it didn't really matter because we brought the cost down with like this activated carbon, so it didn't really matter too much about the cost. So that was really cool. And then also it was more sustainable because most of the commercial ones right now come from coal, which eventually will get depleted. So it's good to have some kind of alternative plan to remove the PFOA and the other things through absorption. So this project, I really enjoyed it, and I was really happy that I was able to do this over the summer.
Okay, good.
Awesome. We do have time for more questions if people have them. I'm keeping up with the chat here if there was another question. I'll give it a few seconds. Okay, for time's sake, we'll just move on, but awesome work. So I'd like to welcome our next speaker. So we have Phan, and hopefully you'll be able to share screen. Is it working?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Yes, just a sound check. Yeah, I will start sharing my screen now. Okay, so. Oh, sorry, it's a bit faulty here. So.
Yeah, it looks good. Perfect. Whenever you're ready.
Oh, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Phan. I'm studying Bachelor of Engineering at Western Sydney University, and my today's topic is about fabrication and evaluation of polymeric nanocomposite using additive manufacturing. And today I will present on behalf of my supervisor, Mr. Nima Zodi, and Professor Richard Young. In general, my project aims to enhance the properties of acrylon neutral butadiene or in short ABS by adding a 0.5% weight fraction of a stronger material, multi-wall carbon nanotube into the system. The results were evaluated in both simulation and experiment. So eventually we observe a significant improvement in both tensile strength and thermal conductivity. The outcome of my result can be employed in various engineering fields, such as prolonging the service life of 3D printed ears and scaffold, creating the electronic sensors in just one go, or even build the small satellites at low cost for the aerospace engineering. To begin with, since the arrival of additive manufacturing, or so-called 3D printing, it has opened a new era of manufacturing complex geometry, but at low cost, lightweight, and less waste. However, due to its low mechanical strength, it is often used for making prototypes rather than practical application. If you can see in this picture, shows a complex model, which is the product of this technology. When it comes to the principle, this technology creates the component by joining the materials layers by layers, and during that process, the air can be trapped between the layers and thus decrease the properties of the whole sample. In these images, you can see the filament or the plastic wire can be fed into this small tube, heated, and then extruded out at the nozzle onto the bed to gradually build a complex geometry look like this in only one go. About the materials that we use for our results, here is the ABS, but it's a very common material that you can find in toys, such as the Lego brick here, packagings, or the lightweight product, and mostly used for all of the 3D printers. As being a plastic, its maximum strength or the tensile strength and its ability to conduct the heat to the outside environment or the thermal conductivity are very low. However, recent studies have discovered a way to improve these properties by adding a stronger material in the form of nano additive into this system to enhance the properties. And with that combination, they can be identified as nanocomposite. On the other hand, without any additive, they are considered as the pure polymeric. Regarding the research methodology, the sample, our sample was called dog-born, and it was designed following the AFSTN standard. The model was first designed in SolidWorks, and then the whole CAD model is imported to this printer slicer for the toolpath. In details, the toolpath contains the location where the small nozzle here should move in the 3D plane in order to steadily create this complex geometry. To maintain the consistency due to the environmental impact, we decide to make 5 samples in one batch, and eventually we fabricated 2 batches. One is for the pure polymeric and one is for the nanocomposite for later comparison. For extracting the tensile strength of the sample, we use this instrument machine. The sample can be mounted vertically in the middle here, and the instrument machine will gradually stretch one end while fixing the other end until the whole sample is totally broken. On the other hand, the thermal conductivity was measured by this C-term equipment. The box here is the controller box, and all of the measured data will be transferred to the computer for later analysis. Thereafter, the material will also model in the MSc Digimat for the simulation result. And this picture here, so the simulation result that I often from MSc Digimat. The green curve is for the polymeric and the blue curve is for the nanocomposite. For further analysis, we have summarized all the results in the following bar charts. By comparing the experimental result of the pure polymeric and the nanocomposite, which are shown in the blue and the red columns here, we have found significant improvement in both the mechanical and the thermal properties. Also, the simulation result in the orange column also indicate the same trend and show a very close values with the experimental one in the blue column. Hence, we can conclude that adding the 0.5% wave fraction of multi-wall carbon nanotubes into the whole ABS matrix did improve both the tensile strength and thermal conductivity of both of the whole system. In the future, we will attempt to improve the accuracy of our simulation and vary the wave fraction to determine the optimal percentage for the highest performance. Eventually, we would like to thank Western Sydney University for supporting us with the funding, facilities, and Digimat support the team for the software consultation, and of course, ACUR for giving me this opportunity to present at the conference. Thank you for listening. I hope you're all healthy and safe during this COVID. Please feel free if you have any question. Thank you.
Thank you. It was really well explained. Again, I'm looking at the chat if people want to ask questions, but we'll head straight to our judges.
Yes, I have one. So how did you choose the ABS as the main material, or is that?
Yes, because this one has its characteristic as the thermoplastic, because in order to use in this printer, right, the material must be melted at some specific temperature. For example, if you use the metal, the melted temperature will be too high and you cannot melt the material. But then we have to use this plastic, this type of plastic. Very useful for this technology currently, yes.
I have another one about the ABS. You already checked the strength. That is very good, and it looks very strong and rigid, of course. But what about the weight? Because this might end up being a component of something very big, and it might have weight on the top coming from the different other components of some equipment which you are making. So how much weight ABS can bear?
So you asking that if I add metal into the system, they will become heavier, right?
Yeah,
yes.
There are components. Then how much weight then this ABS can bear?
Yes, thank you for your question. And if you can see here, I only use the 0.5% weight fraction, which means it doesn't add too much weight into the system, but you know that our goal is to that we add a metal into this plastic, right? They can become more heavier than it was, but it is less weight than the fully rigid metal one. That is the goal. Can you imagine?
So it won't be going to the level where it can crack your 3D printed part, or will it be fine and it can bear enough weight, like let's say a few kilograms? Would it be fine to bear that much weight?
Yes, I think this is fine as long as it is less than what can poorly made by metal or any rigid material. We have satisfied the goal, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question. We will aim to investigate that in the future. Very interesting.
Sure. Thank you.
Still looking at the chat, we have a few attendees, which is really great. Again, if you have any questions, or if the judges have any further questions, we've got time. Oh, here we go, we've got one. Can you explain what is additive manufacturing and how it works?
Yes, additive manufacturing is a technology that creates a component by joining things layers by layers. I don't know if it's all right if I can annotate on my PowerPoint slide to make it clearer for them.
Yeah, go for it. We've definitely got time.
All right, so to make this gas bigger, if you can see this one, we have a nozzle. We have a filament in terms of in blue, for example, and then they will fed into the tube. The tube is in red, and then it will heat through relay to up to the nozzle, and then after nozzle is already melted, and the melted plastic gonna place layer by layer. They're gonna look like this, layer until it's eventually build up something. For example, in this case, I'm building up a rectangle, or the triangle, for example. Then it gradually build up a triangle, or you can, it's just like this one. You can break that into layer, and it will build everything layer by layer. So that is the additive manufacturing. Yes. Thank you. And I will clear my screen if.
No, that was really well explained. Thank you. I'm glad someone asked that question too, because I'm not
very interesting question. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Well, if we don't have any further questions, I might introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker for today is Oliver. So whenever you're ready, you can get the screen up.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'll just start sharing my screen quickly. All right, can everyone see this?
Yeah, looks good and we can hear you.
Fantastic. All right. So thanks everyone for coming today to my presentation on dual-ion batteries. I want to get started by asking a simple question of what does it take to implement renewable energy? Well, we actually need to master three aspects: the generation of energy, the conversion of energy, and the storage of energy. And really, my project today focuses on the storage of energy. Of course, storing energy is important, but it's especially important for renewable types of energy for a couple of reasons. First of all, we can only make renewable energy at certain times of the day. For example, you can't have solar powers creating energy at night. Secondly, sometimes we might generate excess energy and it would be ideal to store it rather than waste it. And finally, there are some socioeconomic factors around the usage of electricity, like the cost of electricity and the fact that there's a peak period of usage around 6 to 7 p.m. that mean having a storage ready to go is really ideal. So I'm sure everyone knows that we use batteries to store energy, but what you might not know is that batteries work by converting electrical energy into chemical energy and vice versa. Now, my project mostly involves analysing electrical energy, and therefore I want to introduce a few terms before I go further for anyone who's out of the discipline. So energy simply refers to the amount of work that can be done by a battery, whereas power refers to the speed at which that work can be done. A really good analogy to understand this is that energy is how far a car can travel, whereas power is how quickly it can accelerate. And furthermore, when it comes to analysing the electrical energy in a battery, it's contained within two parts of the system. The number of charges, for example, chemical ions in a battery, and then the voltage, which is the energy contained in each charge. And therefore, the product of charge and voltage gives us the energy of the battery. We measure charge as the capacity of a battery and voltage as the potential difference of a battery. And since voltage is normally constant in a battery, due to the specific redox chemistry on which that battery operates, battery scientists and engineers really need to find ways to fiddle with the capacity of a battery to improve its efficiency. So with that in mind, it's really important to understand how charge is stored in the traditional battery. So I'm going to present to you a model of a normal battery, which has a cathode and an anode connected by a wire. I'm showing you a lithium-ion battery, which is a really special type of battery that's the most commonly used battery in the world. It's also rechargeable and has a very high capacity in cell voltage. It has a lithium-based cathode and a graphite or carbon-based anode. And of course, batteries also have an electrolyte, which is made up of two ions, a negatively charged anion, here shown in green, and a positively charged cation. And in the case of a lithium battery, that cation is a lithium ion. So in the fully discharged state, a battery contains all of the lithium ions in its cathode. And as we begin charging, there is a transfer of those ions from the cathode into the electrolyte. And further, as we continue charging, lithium ions then move from the electrolyte into the anode via a process called intercalation. And so intercalation simply refers to the movement of an ion into a lattice of carbon atoms, or not necessarily carbon, but into a solid material. And it's important to realize that not all of the lithium ions move at once. Their movement is staggered, but by the end of charging, all of the lithium ions are contained in the anode. So what happens when we connect the battery to a load, like a light bulb, and we start discharging the battery, these lithium ions come back out of the battery via deintercalation, shock horror, and go into the electrolyte and then into the cathode. And so for this reason, these batteries work on something called a rocking chair mechanism, because there is one single ion that moves in and out between these three components, the anode, electrolyte, and cathode. Now this is great, but there are a few limitations of lithium-ion batteries. Firstly, lithium is quite scarce in Earth. Secondly, the lithium cathode here that's used is often a toxic metal oxide, which isn't great for people or the environment. Thirdly, producing these batteries requires a high energetic cost and costs a lot of money. And finally, because the anions are inactive, there's a lost opportunity to create more energy. So a potential solution is the dual ion battery, which is what my project is about. And so in a dual ion battery, we have the main difference is that the cathode is made of graphite rather than lithium. And most importantly, the anion is actually an active species that moves into the cathode. So it moves in the opposite direction to lithium. So this shows a battery while it's charging, and when it's discharging, both ions would be moving the opposite way. And what's important about a dual ion battery is that because we have a second ion moving as well, the voltage is bigger than a lithium ion battery. And this diagram here shows the specific dual ion battery that I was aiming to make, namely using lithium and PF6, which is a big type of anion. So with that in mind, we wish to understand the benefits and limitations of dual ion batteries. And therefore, in this kind of primary investigation, my aims were twofold. Firstly, to actually fabricate a dual ion battery, and secondly, to test their electrochemical properties, mainly the energy density, rate capability, and cyclic stability. Now, I mentioned before that intercalation is the movement of charges or ions, and that it is this movement of ions that gives the battery its energy. And so in asking these three questions, I'm really asking how much energy can this battery hold? How quickly can we get rid of that energy or use it? And thirdly, over time, will the energy that the battery can hold decrease? So I want to first talk about how electrodes are fabricated, because it's a very critical part of the battery making process, and it took a long time for us to get right. Electrodes are made first as a slurry, where you mix the relevant ingredients in the right proportion. You then coat this slurry onto a piece of foil using a doctor blade, which allows you to achieve a very specific thickness, and you then let it dry. The reason it's important to have a specific thickness is because the density of the electrode can actually impact the way intercalation works, and therefore it's important to get right. We then calendar it, which is another way of ensuring a uniform thickness, and finally punch electrodes out. Then we come to actually fabricating the battery itself. And this might not look like a battery that you're used to, because it's called a swage lock cell, or a T cell, and it actually involves 3 electrodes. So what we do is we have our cathode here in red connected to a current collector, which is just a piece of metal that completes a circuit. We then put in a separator, which is a piece of filter paper soaked in electrolyte. And then on the other side of that, we have our anode, again collected to a current collector. The purpose of the separator is to prevent electrons moving from the cathode to the anode, which would short circuit the battery, but to allow ions to move between the two. And then the third, or the reference electrode, is added as well, and that's shown in green. The benefit of this 3 battery system is that it allows us to measure what's happening at the cathode and anode independently as well as together. And therefore, it's really ideal for experimenting with different batteries. Of course, in a real life application, you would not have a reference electrode, and the battery would just have these two electrodes down here. So once we've made our battery, we then test it using something called a galvanostatic charge-discharge experiment, where we apply a constant current and measure the response voltage. And we test various different current rates that are all normalized to the mass of the electrode. So for example, 10 milliamps per gram. We can then determine the capacity of the battery by multiplying the current and time. And finally, we plot various different graphs. So the first graph that I want to talk to you about is called a Ragone plot. And you can see here, it plots the energy density in watt-hours per kilogram on the y-axis against power density in watts per kilogram. So these have both been normalized to the weight of the electrode. Now, the fact that we're plotting this graph at all, and the shape of it, shows us that the faster we drain the battery, the less we can actually drain from the battery. And that is indicated by the shape. Now, that's a very important and interesting finding. But this graph also tells us a few other things. The first is that the maximum energy density of our battery is 167 watt-hours per kilogram. And this was unexpectedly lower than a standard lithium-ion battery. And so we sought out to rationalize this. And we thought, well, if energy is simply voltage multiplied by capacity, and we know from before that the voltage of a dual-ion battery is bigger due to its chemistry, then this must mean that the capacity of our dual-ion battery is actually smaller. And this can be rationalized by thinking about the anion PF6, which is really quite large and therefore might not be able to fit into the electrode very well. We can also learn about the power density of our battery. Now, power density is application dependent, by which I mean, if I need an energy of 100 watt-hours per kilogram, clearly I can have any power underneath 1,500. But if I only need 10 watt-hours per kilogram, I have access to a larger range of powers. But despite this application dependency, it's still overall lower than a standard lithium-ion battery. And this was a little bit unexpected, given that the anion PF6, which the dual-ion battery uses, is able to diffuse very quickly through solution and into the electrode. Now, I keep referencing a standard lithium-ion battery, and that's because we were unable to create a comparator cell, or essentially a control in our project. And this is kind of a next step that we need to do. This graph shows the rate capability, essentially the discharge capacity, or the number of charges against a variety of different current rates. You can see that there's a clear peak here showing us that a current rate of 20 to 50 milliamps per gram is most optimal, and this peak also corresponds to the Ragone plot. Finally, I want to talk about cyclic stability. You can see here that initially the capacity drops quite quickly, but reaches a very stable plateau over 75 cycles. And this indicates a very promising result for the cyclic stability, although ideally we would have tested the battery for longer, but unfortunately that wasn't possible due to project time constraints. So in conclusion, dual-ion batteries have a lower energy density and power density than lithium-ion batteries, which was a little bit unexpected and a bit of a shame. However, they're still useful. And the reason for that is because they are able to be created in a more sustainable way, they're able to be recycled easier, and they have a good cyclic stability. And therefore, they're ideal for usage in the electricity grid, where we can make a battery as big as we want, and therefore density is not a limiting factor. So whilst dual-ion batteries might not be the next battery in your Tesla car, they could revolutionize the electricity grid. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. That was really well explained. I'm very impressed with the 3 today. Like, you've all explained it very well to someone who's not in your area. So I appreciate it. Again, please put your questions in the chat and we'll go straight to the judges for questions.
Yeah, I have one question. So why did the cyclic, if you go back one slide, yeah, why did it drop dramatically at the start?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that question. So this is actually a well-observed phenomena in batteries, but I just glossed over it in the name of time and simplicity. So what happens when you first charge a battery is that the lithium ions in solution will form something called a solid electrolyte interphase layer, or an SEI layer for short. And so what this means is that your charges kind of combine with the organic electrolyte. So, you know, we use DMC or ethylene carbonate as well. So they all combine and form a coating on the electrode. And this means that some of your charges that were in the electrolyte are now trapped in this coating. And therefore, since capacity is a measure of the amount of charge that can move, it leads to an irreversible loss in capacity, is what people in the field call it. And so this will always happen when you first run the battery for the first 5 or so cycles. The capacity will decrease once that stable SEI layer has formed, then it'll kind of stay the same. Although you'd expect as the cycle number continues, often there's a decrease in capacity, but we haven't observed that to a great extent here.
Okay.
Thank you, Oliver. Very nice talk and very well explained. I have 2 questions. One is that why you use this particular type of electrolyte, why PF, I think 4 or 6, why not anything else you considered which might increase again? Although cyclic stability is good, but again, the capability could be even better using another electrolyte.
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually got the inspiration for this battery from a company called Power Japan Plus, based in Japan or in Tokyo. And they actually have developed a dual ion battery and brought it to market. And they're trying to kind of get it into Volvo cars and whatnot. And they made all sorts of claims in a press release in 2014 saying that their battery was, you know, super efficient and really stable and really cost effective. And so we kind of got inspiration from them. And the first part of this project actually involved a literature review of their patents and some of the literature that they've published to work out how they created their battery. So essentially we recreated their battery in order to test it. And that's why we used PF6, because that's what they used. And similarly, the concentration of the electrolyte kind of is all designed to match their battery. I guess the next step of this project would be to change the concentration of the electrolyte, and also, as you suggested, to change the anion to different possibilities. But unfortunately, due to the COVID lockdowns that are currently in Canberra and, you know, all around Australia, we had to cut that short.
And am I getting right? Is PF is a phosphorus fluoride something, right?
Yeah, that's
good. Thank you. I have another question that you keep comparing it with lithium ion batteries. Did you also consider like a nickel cadmium or other batteries, or lithium being the best?
Yeah, so we mostly considered lithium ion batteries because they're the best and the most widely used. And if this dual ion battery was to kind of shock the market and you know, take over, it would really be the lithium ion battery that it's competing with, especially because the lithium ion battery is the leading technology in rechargeable batteries, and that's kind of what we would need for grid integration. So that's why we compared it strongly there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question in the chat. I'm just reading it aloud. Here we go. So it's, what is the purpose of the reference electrolyte? How does the electrolyte soaked separator work? Is the fabricating batteries in your experiment the same used as in industry? And they say, great presentation. So
yeah, I'll just come back here. So the purpose of the third electrode. So basically, to measure the voltage in any system, you need 2 points, right? You probably might remember from kind of science in school, you plug a voltmeter in parallel in a circuit, right? So if we wanted to measure the, let me just annotate this. If we wanted to measure the voltage across the cathode and anode, we would plug a voltmeter across here. And that's great. And we actually do that in order to make sure that the cell's working. But then when we plug it into a special apparatus to test the cell, we also connect here and here. And what this allows us to do is measure the voltage through any of these 3 directions. And therefore we can see how the voltage and the capacity of the cathode and the anode changes individually of each other as the battery is being charged and discharged. The reason that that's useful is because these kind of capacity and voltage graphs, which I've not really included in this presentation, tell us a lot about the chemistry, the underlying chemistry. And so although my presentation is in an engineering seminar, I actually did this as part of the Research School of Chemistry at ANU. And so in particular, intercalation works in different stages. And so what happens is you kind of get a series of plateaus that show you the 4 stages of intercalation. And so by having these 3 electrodes, you can see intercalation occurring at the cathode and the anode. Whereas if you just had the 2 electrodes down the bottom, you wouldn't be able to see that. And so to answer the second part of that question, how is this different from normal batteries? Essentially, a normal battery just contains what's in the red circle. Well, not really what's in the red circle. It just contains this component here. So it just has a cathode, an anode, and an electrolyte soaked separator. And so that's enough to supply a voltage and to do work like powering a light bulb or a torch. And finally, to answer your question of the electrolyte soaked separator and what that does. So it's essentially a filter paper, like just a piece of filter paper that you would find in a chemistry lab that we've dipped into a solution containing the lithium PF6 ions and whatever it's solvated in. And we use ethylene carbonate, which is a little bit beyond probably what you need to know. And basically it's kind of just a little, like a wet thing that connects the cathode and the anode and allows the ions to pass through, but not electrons. So it's very similar to in a galvanic cell to the salt bridge that you would see like in high school chemistry. The reason electrons don't pass through it is because it's easier for electrons to travel in a metal wire outside than through a quite dense separator. However, without the separator, if we just had the anode and the cathode touching each other directly, you would just have 2 pieces of metal touching each other. And so the electrons would instantaneously transfer and you would kind of short circuit your cell. And at that point, you can't use it. And so constructing these things is a really fiddly operation. And several times I messed up and, put the separator here instead. And so these were able to touch and then I had to throw away like 3 days of work. So it's a pretty fiddly operation, but we got there in the end. Thank you for that question.
Oh, just a comment. I don't know if it was intentional or not. With your color grid, you end up making a French flag.
Yeah, I did notice that. Yeah.
Yes, if there's any other questions in the chat, I'm happy to read them aloud. We're very lucky, actually. We have a fair bit of time, a few minutes. If people even have questions for previous presenters. Here we go. Your conclusions state that DIBs perform worse than LIBs. Is this a widely accepted general result or specific to this battery? If it's a general result, why? And they say, thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, so, of course, with any kind of science project and any undergraduate project, which you spend only 6 months on, it's a little bit probably overzealous to generalize your results to say that any dual ion battery ever would be worse than a lithium ion battery. I mean, certainly the people at Power Japan Plus who developed a dual ion battery seem to think it's just as good, if not better. I guess the reason I've kind of made this conclusion is that based on the cells that we created using that system that I've just outlined, the energy density and the power density and the rate capability seemed not to be as good as a lithium ion battery within an accepted range. So for example, lithium ion batteries can range from like 150 to 250 watt hours per kilogram, whereas our our dual ion battery was 167. So, I mean, that would make it a little bit better than some lithium ion batteries, but worse than a few others. And as you make more dual ion batteries, I guess we'd be able to build more of a range. So really, this is a tentative result. But in a previous slide, I stressed the need to create a comparator cell. And the reason for this is, if you think about like a battery that you put in like a Wii remote controller or something, it's like those little cylindrical AA batteries. If you think about a battery that goes in a phone, it's like a flat rectangular square pack. And so all these different shapes and sizes give us different geometric properties of the battery. And that can result in different functionality essentially. And so I guess the next step of this project would be to create a lithium ion battery using the exact same system that we made our dual ion battery in, and then to compare it there. So I guess to answer your question, it's not a very general result. No, it's, I guess, specific to what we've made here.
Thanks. I was just about to say, like, it's been a really great turnout for this session. I'm really glad people are actually asking questions. So this has been a very successful session for me. So unfortunately, that kind of does bring us to time. If you do have questions, I'm sure you can email our presenters today. I know it can be kind of scary asking in a conference, but I'm sure they'd love to hear from you. So a big thank you to our judges and, congratulations to our student presenters. Of course, this recording will be made available online following the conference, and we hope to see you in other conference sessions.
Thank you.
Thank you.